much to the committee for inviting me. What I want to focus on in this paper is militancy, the militancy engaged in by the Irish Women's Franchise League from 1912, a militancy that saw suffragettes such as Sheehy Skeffington arrested and go on hunger strike in the period 1912-14. In particular, I want to consider what militancy was understood to mean for the suffrage activists, what it represented for them. I wanted to argue that so-called suffrage violence gave rise within the wider patriarchal society to a definition or interpretation of militancy that was gendered. Behaviour acceptable from men, militant behaviour acceptable from men, was deemed violent when engaged in by women. And this is quite an obvious statement, and it could be made more nuanced, as I hope to show. Female violence, when under the tutelage of men in this period, 1912 to, I suppose, going on to 16, female violence when under the tutelage of men, notably in pursuit of the nationalist agenda, was acceptable, or at least more acceptable than suffrage violence. Violence by women in pursuit of women's rights, violence by women in pursuit of their own rights, was not acceptable within this patriarchal society. So just some background. I'm sure everybody knows about the trajectory of the suffrage campaign in England and Ireland, but some small background. In 1867, the all-male British House of Commons rejected John Stuart Mill's amendment to the Franchise Reform Bill to allow women to vote on the same property terms as men. The dismissal of this amendment led to the establishment of formal suffrage societies across England and Ireland. So in 1872, Isabella Todd set up a suffrage society in the north of Ireland, and Anna and Thomas Haslam in 1876 set up a society in Dublin, which would become by 1901 the Irish Suffrage and Local Government Association. So these societies were set up in the 60s, but despite over 4 decades of campaigning, female suffrage had still not been achieved by 1914. The suffrage campaign in both Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom can be divided into 2 phrases: constitutional and militant. Early suffrage activists, such as the women in the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association, they worked by legal means, holding meetings, petitioning MPs, conducting letter-writing campaigns. Their tactics were genteel, as befitted the image of women in this patriarchal society. Under the dominant discourse of separate spheres, men and women occupied separate and unique spheres. Males and females, according to the discourse, were born with innate characteristics to equip them for their role in society. Women were inherently meek, passive, nurturing and caring, all traits which accorded with their role as wife and mother in the domestic sphere. Notably, rather than using the language of gender equality, early suffrage campaigners focused on the language and constructs of the ideology of separate spheres to argue for a greater role for women in the public sphere. You could argue that this was quite subversive. Instead of denying women's role as wife and mother, they argued that an enhanced, for example, more academic education would allow them to better fulfil that role. Women, they said, were accorded with the task of ensuring that children emerged as fully functioning adults, imbued with the correct moral and spiritual values. The future stability of society rested with women as mothers within the domestic sphere, according to this thinking, and a better education for women could, Thomas Haslam argued, only enhance that role. And of course this was something that Mary Wollstonecraft had argued at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, that better education would make women better wives and mothers. By the end of the 19th century, female activists in the suffrage campaign across Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom had certainly facilitated the advancement of gender equality in a number of crucial areas. Educational rights for women had progressed at both secondary and third level status. Trinity College Dublin was the last Irish university to open its doors to women in 1904. Female activists in the suffrage campaign could also point to advances in property rights for married women. With the passing of the Married Women's Property Act 1882, women could own property brought to marriage or gained during its time period. Previous to the passing of the Married Women's Property Rights from 1870, a married woman's legal existence was subsumed into that of her husband. She was described as a femme covert. She was not permitted to own property in her own right. She had no need of the vote, it was argued, because by voting himself, the husband voted on behalf of his wife. By the early 20th century, campaigning by suffragists had also secured the local government franchise for Irish women. The 1898 Local Government Ireland Act granted rural and urban district council voting rights to women. In 1911, Irish women received the right to sit on and vote for county councils. This was 4 years after the right had been granted to English women. Suffragists in the constitutional campaign are not associated with the glamour and daring according to militant suffragettes such as Sheehy Skeffington. The iconic image of Derby Day, the 31st of May, 1913, when Emily Wilding Davison ran to her death in front of the King's horse, speaks of passion and unrelenting principle. The English suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst, was a poised, elegant and well-dressed woman. She was a woman with a core of steel, however, who forced the British government to take notice of the demand for female suffrage with a number of high visibility tactics, and we'll see that Hannah was very, very similar in her approach. In England, Emmeline Pankhurst, who established the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903, marshalled a women's army, conducting large-scale marches to show the numerical strength of the demand for female suffrage. However, it would be wrong to dismiss the early constitutional suffragists as priggish or conservative, and certainly Hannah would have believed that she was, she owed them much. It would be wrong to dismiss them as priggish, conservative, and it would be historically inaccurate not to recognise the gains they had achieved in the area of equality for women in society in a range of areas by the early 20th century. However, in this early 20th century, a new generation of suffrage activists emerged in Ireland and England. And many of these women had benefited from the advances in female education I just mentioned. Sheehy Skeffington was one such woman. Sheehy Skeffington was educated to third level status. She had a master's. And this new generation believed that new tactics had to be injected into the cause of to attain the still elusive, if they were to attain the still elusive parliamentary vote. In 1903, as I said, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia established the Women's Social and Political Union in England, and with this foundation, with the foundation of this organisation, the suffragette was born. Amongst other tactics, suffragettes believed in using militancy in pursuit of the vote. Now, interestingly, society viewed militancy through the lens of appropriate gender roles. So what was deemed militant when a woman behaved in such a fashion was not necessarily deemed militant if it was behaviour engaged in by a man. So, for example, while heckling was a staple of election meetings throughout the 19th century, when women, men heckling, when women employed the tactic in pursuit of the vote, this was deemed violence, and these females were denounced as a streaking sisterhood. The suffragette was used as a term of abuse and ridicule by the hostile press. That's just an it was just an example of the well-dressed Emmeline Pankhurst. But this is just an example of the type of ridicule that was employed against suffragettes. So you can see at 15, a little cat, she's a little coquette at 20, but then things go downhill at 14, not married, and then having nothing else to do, having not been kissed, as one other postcard said, she turns into some kind of a harridan. In 1905, the first act of militancy was actually committed in England, and what it was that Christabel Pankhurst spat on the face of a policeman and was arrested. Now, spitting is not obviously very pleasant, but is it violent? She refused to pay the fine for propaganda reasons, and she was arrested. In Ireland, the new generation of suffrage activists, such as Sheehy Skeffington and Margaret Cousins, were very, very aware of the WSPU, and they established the Irish Women's Franchise League in 1908. Now, very, very importantly, although they had the same tactics as the WSPU, they were very adamant that this was not a branch of the WSPU, that it was a separate Irish suffrage organisation. During the period of the debate on the Third Home Rule Bill of 1912, the issue of suffrage versus the nationalist cause crystallised and came to the fore in Irish society. The first act that the Irish Women's Franchise League wanted to do, the first thing that they wanted to achieve, was to ensure that votes for women were included in the Third Home Rule Bill. But this caused the issue of suffrage versus nationalism to crystallise, and there was discourse on what was appropriate militancy. And who should be engaging in militancy and in pursuit of what cause. In 1910, a cross-party conciliation committee had been appointed in the House of Commons in Westminster and in the House of Parliament of Westminster, and had been this cross-party conciliation committee had been appointed to draft a women's suffrage bill that would find favour with all parties. The following year, a new conciliation bill came before Parliament, that's 1911, and 31 Irish Parliamentary Party MPs voted for the bill. That's the party which was supporting Home Rule, which was agitating for Home Rule. But on the second reading of the bill in 1912, not one Irish Parliamentary Party MP voted for that bill. Home Rule was a priority, and the actions of the Irish Party MPs in voting against the conciliation bill can be explained in large part in relation to the fears of the fall of the government over the issue of women's suffrage. The Irish Parliamentary Party held the balance of power in Parliament since 1910, and in return for supporting Liberal Party measures, the Liberal Party pledged to bring before Parliament a third Home Rule bill. So this was a Liberal Irish Parliamentary Party alliance. And very, very importantly, in 1911, the Parliament Act was passed, and this reduced the House of Lords' veto to a 2-year staying power. And this was crucial. The second Home Rule Bill of 1893 had passed the Commons but had been rejected by the House of Lords. Now, with the Lords' veto reduced to a 2-year hold on a bill, the third Home Rule had a real chance of success, and Hannah and the other women in the Irish Women's Franchise League knew that they had to try to ensure that votes for women were included in this Home Rule Bill. However, the personal opposition to female suffrage held by many Irish Parliamentary Party MPs, notwithstanding John Redmond, the leader, for example, didn't believe in women having the vote at all. But even aside from personal considerations, the Irish Parliamentary Party were not going to support women's suffrage for fear that the issue would force a general election and destabilise the move towards the fruition of destabilise the move towards achievement of Home Rule. In 1912, in opposition to the refusal of the Irish Parliamentary Party to include votes for women in the third Home Rule Bill, Irish Women's Franchise League members threw stones at government buildings in Dublin and were arrested, and Sheehy Skeffington was imprisoned in Mountjoy Jail. Sheehy Skeffington, as so many of the suffragettes in this period, was adept at taking advantage of every opportunity to, in the words of Maria Luddy, quote, make political capital in favour of suffrage. She used every opportunity she could find to claim the public space in the most visible and high-profile way possible. Throughout 1913 and into 1914, members of the Irish Franchise League engaged in acts of militancy in pursuit of the female vote. In June 1913, for example, a fete was held at the People's Park in Kingstown to raise money for the building of a new home for the working man's club in the town, and this fete was opened and addressed by the Lord Lieutenant. And we're told that as soon as he began speaking, a woman in the crowd shouted out, and this is a report from a newspaper from the period, quote, "How dare you come to Kingstown when women are being tortured in prison and subjected to injustices?" End quote. The newspaper continued, quote, "The woman, the well-known campaigner for the vote, Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington, was seized by a detective and removed from the park." So that's an example of claiming the public space by Hannah in a very, very high-profile way. The Lord Lieutenant was opening the fete, and clearly there would be publicity as a result of her protest. Another example, in November 1913, the leader of the Conservative Party, Andrew Bonar, visited Dublin, and the Irish Citizen, the paper of the Irish Women's Franchise League, established in 1912 and run by Frances Sheehy Skeffington and James Cousins, the husbands of the two leaders or founders of the Irish Women's Franchise League. This paper called for pressure to be placed on Andrew Bonar to declare his position on the issue of female suffrage. Bonar refused to meet with Irish suffrage activists, and as a result, women in the Irish Women's Franchise League and the Irish Women's Reform League distributed handbills targeting politically charged locations. So Bonar, for example, was staying together with the Ulster Unionist leader Edward Carson at the house of Lord Ivy on St. Stephen's Green, and the women handed out bills outside that house. They also distributed bills to passing individuals outside the Conservative Club, where the high-profile men were dining, and outside their meeting place near the Theatre Royal. Now again, this isn't very militant, in terms of there's no violence, this is handing out bills, but the situation escalated. And during this protest, Hannah was arrested on the charge of assaulting a member of the Dublin Metropolitan Police and was arrested. A newspaper of the 28th of November stated, The incident involving Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington and the policeman occurred outside Lord Ivy's house on St. Stephen's Green. As Mr. Bonnerlaw and Sir Edward Carson emerged to pose for photographs, one of the protesters, Mrs. Connery, it's Meg Connery, rushed forward to thrust leaflets in his direction. Mrs. Connery was stopped by a policeman, and as she was being removed, though not arrested, Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington approached from another side when, according to the Irish Citizen, she was seized with great violence by a Sergeant Thomas who twisted her arms. Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington broke free of his clutch but was later arrested and charged with assaulting him. And the trial took place immediately afterwards, that very day. And at the trial hours later, the policeman swore that the defendant had ran at him and struck him on the chest with her elbow, adding that she had punched him several times on the arm. "I feel the pain still," he remarked some 3 hours after the incident occurred. This part of the sergeant's testimony elicited laughter in the courtroom, where the contrast in size between Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington and the gigantic sergeant was all too apparent. Now, this is funny, but actually this was something which was a feature of suffrage militancy in this period. The juxtaposition of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and the policeman recorded in this paper is noteworthy, the juxtaposition of their physique. Despite the brutality of patriarchy expressed in the reality of economic inequality in this period and sexual and behavioural double standards, the public mask of this society, the public mask of Victorian and Edwardian society, was assembled and constructed through the language of chivalry and male care of the fairer and weaker sex. Many of the visuals of the militant activity by the WSPU are images of well-dressed women being physically moved against their will or restrained by policemen. And this is just an example of Emmeline Pankhurst being led away from Buckingham Palace by Superintendent Rolfe sometime in 1914. And you can see, you know, that he has enough strength to lift her off her feet. So, you know, the idea of the males looking after the weaker sex, it's belied by this type of an imagery which was very much in the media in this time period. And Emmeline Pankhurst was conscious of the potential, the propaganda potential of this type of juxtaposition of the weaker woman in terms of physicality and the male officialdom. These impressions underscore the difference in male and female physique and convey a sense, and this is the important thing, convey a sense of official brutality and violence against female activists, while that very officialdom was denouncing female violence. Emmeline Pankhurst indeed was aware of the potency of such images, and she always exhorted WSPU women to dress in as refined manner as possible. She wanted them to appear respectable, so the respectable woman in flowing dress was to serve as a foil to the brutish policeman clad in his official uniform, the symbol of government and officialdom. And I think it's interesting that that type of juxtaposition appeared in that newspaper account of the trial of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in November 1913. Hannah was sentenced, and she went on hunger strike following that trial. And this was very much a tactic of the period, a tactic of the suffrage deaths. And it was a tactic to gain maximum publicity for the cause. The policy was implemented in English prisons from July 1909. As the historian William Murphy states, quote, "The English prison system became a political battlefield," end quote. Indeed, the very presence of suffrage activists in prison, even before this date, saw the government uncertain as how to respond in terms of prisoner classification and the treatment of these women. The hunger strikes accentuated issues of power and gender within British society. And this would have been very much the case also when women such as Hannah Sheehy Skeffington went on hunger strike in Ireland. Under the ideology of separate spheres, men provided for and were supposed to provide for and care for women. Yet here were men, members of the establishment, employees of the establishment, allowing women to starve. In this context, female death by hunger strike in English prisons and Irish prisons could not be contemplated by the government. And there was a decision by government from mid-1909 to forcibly feed those on hunger strikes, but that did nothing to assuage the situation, as stories of women being held down by prison and medical officials, as a medical feeding tube was brutally forced down their throats, entered the public domain through suffrage propaganda, letters and reports to newspapers. Now this is actually an example of an anti-suffrage celebration of female of forcible feeding, but the issue was very much before the public in this way, and it was quite damaging to government. You know, the idea of the metal tube being forced down the woman's mouth as she was physically restrained had all the connotations of oral rape. Now, in Ireland, it should be noted that although the hunger strike was used as a weapon by such as Sheehy Skeffington, there was no forcible feeding of Irish suffrage activists. There were two members of WSPU who had come to Ireland in 1912 and who had been arrested for throwing a hatchet, albeit a fake hatchet, into the carriage in which Redmond and Asquith were travelling and setting fire to the Theatre Royal. They were arrested and they were forcibly fed, but there was no forcible feeding of Irish suffrage activists. Hannah was never forcibly fed. And in the context of that arrest in November 1913, Hannah had been released, or she was released after a 92-hour fast, and she emerged weak, and but she hadn't been forcibly fed. She did emerge to find that she had lost her teaching job at the Rathmines School of Commerce. So going into 1914, Hannah had very much suffered financially and in terms of her career for her prison activities, for her suffrage activities and her imprisonment. Now, Hannah interestingly viewed the hunger strike as a form of passive resistance. She referred to the tactic as having been implemented in Russian prisons. However, Hannah in this period began to define the use of militancy in the context of suffrage activism. She argued that militancy was a propaganda tool, ensuring that the issue of suffrage remained in the public eye. And in this period, a lot of female activists who did have certain pacifist beliefs began to analyse their position on suffrage violence. Hannah, of course, was married to the avowed pacifist Francis Sheehy Skeffington. Hannah made a distinction between militancy and militarism. Opposed to militarism as the institutional response of those in authority to power challenges, she believed that militancy was, by contrast, a legitimate response of the oppressed to the oppressor. And Hannah linked suffrage militancy with the militancy of the colonial oppressed in Ireland and elsewhere. And this was by contrast to, for example, the suffrage activist Louis Bennett, who opposed all forms of violence. The Waterford activist Rosamond Jacob's attitude to suffrage violence fell somewhere between these two positions, and arguably she never clarified the position to herself. Rosamond Jacob made a distinction between violence as a premeditated act as opposed to that carried out on impulse. She wrote in 1912, when suffrage violence was high in both Ireland and England. Jay Upton came and paid us a visit. We were talking about the suffragettes, and I said I didn't think isolated acts of violence done in cold blood for the sake of violence were the wisest method to adopt. That I thought, as for riot and bloodshed, they would be justified in going to almost any lengths, but it should be done in crowds and in hot blood to be effective. So women in the suffrage campaign, female activists in the campaign for suffrage in this time period, are questioning the use of violence. They're analysing it. They're discoursing on it. They're not, engaging in this violence as anything bloodthirsty at all. They see it very much as a way of putting keeping the cause before the public. In July 1912. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington wrote equating suffrage militancy with the tradition in Ireland of national militancy against colonial oppression. So this is very much a theme of Hannah in this period. In the Irish Citizen, in July 1912, Francis Sheehy Skeffington actually similarly created an analogy between the sacrifices of the suffragist and those of Irish Republican heroes, such as Emmet, declaring, "There is a stronger and purer nationalism in Mountjoy prison at this moment than any Mr. Redmond's followers can boast." However, notably, Francis Sheehy Skeffington and indeed Louis Bennett, who I mentioned a moment ago, were opposed to the outbreak of the First World War, seeing it as the product of patriarchal militarism as opposed to militancy in pursuit of female vote, and as such a threat to feminism. For Hannah, and I think this is an important point, for Hannah, what distinguished women's militancy for the vote was that it was militancy in support of their own rights. And this was problematic, she was aware, to the patriarchal society. This element of unwomanly selfishness was repellent to the average man, who only applauds the stone thrower as long as the missile is flung for them and not at them. This distinction between militancy by women as an aid to male political aims and militancy in pursuit of female equality was core to one of the few, in fact I think the only novel written in Ireland on the issue of suffrage and nationalism in this time period. It was a very dreadful novel in terms of its, I think, literary, it's not aesthetic, but it certainly tells the historian a lot. And this was a novel written by the Waterford Quaker Rosamond Jacob, who has become quite friendly with Hannah in this time period, the early in the early years of the second decade of the 20th century. This was a novel entitled Callahan. It was published in 1920, but Jacob was writing it in this time period, 1912 into 1914, and it deals with that time period, and it deals with issues of suffrage and nationalism. And the novel very much focuses on received notions of masculinity and femininity and exposes them. Andy Callahan, the so-called hero of the novel, is a volunteer after an Irish volunteer after the split occurred following Redmond's speech in 1914, and he is going to marry Frances Moran, and she is a suffrage activist, and he's opposed to her suffrage activism on so many levels. But he couches this opposition using the language of female frailty and the imperative of men to protect women. In the novel, Andy prevented Frances protesting against Redmond's refusal to consider the issue of female suffrage. Heckling Redmond when he spoke in Ireland in support of the 1912 Home Rule Bill was a staple tactic of suffragettes. During the height of the militant suffrage campaign in 1914, for example, Jacob received a letter from Hannah indicating her intention to travel to Waterford with other members of the Irish Women's Franchise League to heckle Redmond, and Hannah was asking Jacob for help with hospitality. So in this novel, Frances is going to heckle Redmond. And crucially, Andy Callahan, prevents her. And it's again issues of power and powerlessness. Callahan used his superior strength to constrain Frances. Callahan's fear of violence being directed against Frances by Redmond's supporters was no barrier to his belief that he had the right to restrain her with violence. Jacob highlights the fundamental nature of male power over women in a scene with suggestions of sexual assault. And I think this scene was designed in the novel to make a wider point about the manner in which male power and superior strength was utilised as a weapon against the suffragettes. And I think the controversial and topical issue of forcible feeding may have been in Jacob's mind in constructing the scene. So she's attempting to go to carry out the heckling of Redmond. Callahan stood up and caught her abruptly in his arms, holding her with his left arm around her waist and with his right hand on the back of her head, pressing her face against his breast to keep her from screaming in her sudden terror until she could neither speak nor breathe. "Be quiet," he said roughly, as Frances made a desperate attempt to free herself and did her best to cry out. And Jacob's description of male physical power, utilised in this way, captured much of what suffrage campaigners experienced. For Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Hannah read this novel, the scene reminded her of assaults by policemen in the suffrage agitation. The violence of the militant campaign permeated attitudes to women across a wide spectrum in this time period. The violence, for example, I'm just going to give one example here. The violence was felt, for example, at the level of local Waterford politics. Redmond, of course, was MP for Waterford, so Waterford was important in this context. By the second decade of the 20th century, it is clear from the papers that there was a growing recognition or grudging acceptance in Waterford society of the idea of female suffrage. Suffrage meetings were reported on without too much fuss or horror in the local papers. However, there was a hatred of militancy in pursuit of the female vote coming through in the papers. So we can say, I think, that the Waterford press records a sort of grudging surface acceptance by men of the more visible women, we can say that the Waterford press records a sort of grudging surface acceptance by men of the more visible presence of women in public life in the early 20th century, consequent on expanding educational opportunities and the opening up of local government franchises. As I said, by 1911, Irish women had received the right to sit on and vote for county councils. A year later, Waterford Corporation had 2 women councillors, Mary Strangman, Dr. Mary Strangman, and Mrs. Lily Poole. However, at various pressure points, the acceptance of the greater presence of women in Waterford public life was shown to be quite superficial. And crucially, the violence of suffragettes was turned back as a weapon against women who sought to leave the public sphere. Lily Poole, was elected to Waterford Corporation a month after Strangman in February 1912. And she declared that, quote, now she had got in, she would do all in her power to show that a woman would be equal to a man, end quote. This was much easier said than done, as a very interesting argument at a corporation meeting in August 1912 signified. At a meeting in August 1912, there was a debate over the right of a woman to apply for the position of Secretary to the City Insurance Committee. And at this debate, the incident of the hatchet thrown into the carriage in which Redmond and Asquith were travelling in July 1912 by WSPU activists made its presence felt in the Waterford Council chambers. Councillor Hackett began saying, with a highly resentful tone, the paper reports, I agree with you that women are quite capable of doing everything a man can do nowadays. To which Mrs. Poole replied, so we will find eventually. And this prompted a knee-jerk reaction from the mayor, who declared, I promise you I won't vote for a woman. At this point in the debate, the latent discomfort of some male councillors at shifting gender roles in Waterford society came to the fore, a discomfort similar to that described through the character of Andy Callaghan, and which Hannah had identified when she referred to men only applauding the stone thrower as long as the missile is flung for them and not at them. So the debate continues. Mr. Feely said a woman could be secretary as well as a man, and Dr. Strangman said that should be made clear. But this is where the hatchet comes in. Take care, any of them, the women don't have a hatchet, said Mr. Hackett. Mr. Hackett said he did not agree with Dr. Strangman at all that a woman ought to get this position. He thought that women ought to be kept out of such places. The gentleman went on to say that Dr. Strangman always availed of every opportunity she got to put a word in for the women. He had no objection to her doing so, but at the present time women were unfortunately trying to drive men out of positions by accepting a lower wage, and he thought, and this is important, that men of Waterford should take up the cudgels and keep Dr. Mary Strangman from getting in a woman to the position. He continues, Dr. Strangman never lost an opportunity of putting in a word for the women. He did not object to that at all. In fact, he gave her credit for it, but as a man he was there to say that a woman ought not to take a man's place at all. This passage, or this debate, report in the papers, is an interesting example at gender rage and violent language at the dissolving of the shifting parameters of the separate spheres. One can sense Hackett's frustration as he begins to repeat himself. And very interesting is the reference to men taking up the cudgels against women. In the debate, women with hatchets are strenuously denounced, but Hackett, albeit probably unconsciously, employs the language and imagery of violence in an attempt to re-establish a gender hierarchy at the level of local politics and local jobs, as Andy Callaghan used force to counter Francis. In the political climate that was Ireland of 1912-14, militant behaviour in pursuit of causes led by men was, according to many suffragists, less heavily censored than violence by suffragettes. So, for example, Edward Carson. Edward Carson was mentioned by a number of suffragettes. And Edward Carson, of course, in the context of the Ulster Unionist opposition to Home Rule, had essentially facilitated the establishment of the Ulster Volunteers, formed in January 1913, and the Ulster Volunteers were an armed force pledged to go to war if necessary to ensure that Home Rule was not imposed on Ulster. On the 9th of April 1914, a woman wielding a meat cleaver, it's not a hatchets and cleavers, smashed 10 cases in the Asiatic section of the British Museum in London. And around the same time, 2 members of the WSPU had appeared in court in Belfast, charged with having in their possession dangerous and explosive substances under suspicious circumstances. And these were women, Dorothy Evans and Maud Muir, and at the court they were supported by a large number of female activists who crowded in and around the courtroom, were told in a local newspaper, disrupting the proceedings and making reference to the fact that these women were being tried, but Edward Carson was allowed to go free despite agitating in a violent manner and actually arming a force in Ulster. This is just an example of, I won't go through it, but Carson again being mentioned. In April 1914, a mansion was burned down outside Carrickmacross in the north, and the Freeman's Journal reported on the fact that the women who burnt down the mansion had left a statement saying, "Justice and fair play for women or militancy must forge ahead. You have betrayed Irish women, therefore we work while you talk." To Sir Edward Carson's deeds, not words. And the piece says, "Why was not Carson in the dock by the side of Dorothy Evans?" So in other words, men advocating violence in this time period as Irish society becomes more militaristic and militant are not attacked in the same way in the courts, are not subject to the same censor as female activists. And it's also, am I finished? Yeah.
No, a few minutes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going on. Let me just move on here. Historians of suffrage militancy have, as June Purvis discusses in her biography of Emmeline Pankhurst, defined militancy as a range of behaviours and actions which challenged thinking about feminine behaviour rather than just behaviours which were about law breaking. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington's view of militancy was very much that formulated and adopted by the Pankhursts in England. Militancy for Emmeline Pankhurst, to quote June Purvis, meant engaging in forms of behaviour that challenged conventional expectations about women being submissive and accepting of their subordinate status. For Christabel Pankhurst, militancy was defined as the putting off of the slave spirit. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why Hannah was so opposed to the establishment of Cumann na mBan in 1914. Cumann na mBan was established not as an equal to the Irish Volunteers, but as an auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers, and essentially Hannah argued that those women were maintaining the slave spirit. So also, you could argue that this was a type of militancy. Cumann na mBan, while they weren't going to, in the early years, go out with guns, they were intended to fundraise to ensure that men were armed. That's a form of militancy, but it was not censored in the same way in the press as suffrage militancy, because it was militancy under the tutelage of men. And I better stop at that point. So, thank you very much.